So we've got problems, we've got challenges, and we obviously need to think about solutions. And I think the first thing we need to think about is what does our whole school approach look like? What does the culture look like in our school? I think sometimes schools' views of literacy or literacy intervention are kind of too heavily focused on what programs can we use for intervention rather than making improvements to classroom pedagogy. So we need to think, does our school really have what's called this tiered strategy? Anybody that's linked to writing your school's pupil premium strategy will be familiar with the EF's tiered approach. So it's this idea that, half of your efforts and money should be spent around improving the quality of teaching, okay? And then you've got like a quarter on targeted academic support, i.e. interventions, and then you've got a quarter on wider strategies. Now, that's the model for how we spend the pupil premium, but that model can easily be used when we're thinking about literacy. What are we doing to improve the experience of all our students in the classroom? What are we doing in terms of interventions for a minority? And then what are we doing to enrich that experience for everybody? If you're not involved in writing your school's pupil premium strategy, or you've never heard about it before, go back to school and ask about it, because it should be done as a team effort. And whoever's writing it should be having conversations with you about how we're spending the pupil premium to support literacy. Okay, some schools are doing this really well. Some schools need to brush up on that, but you can go back and ask the questions. Okay, so it's about shifting culture, but then it's about, are we being driven by assessment in our school rather than assumption? So I think it's safe to say the majority of schools now measure reading in some form. Some might use the big organisations with big standardisation samples up and down the country. Some might use some freebies online. That's fine. The most important thing is, what do we do with that? But I think from a teacher's point of view, if we're sharing reading age information with them and we see a low reading age of 8 for a student in year 9, it's really, really tempting just to look at that number and to think about the symptoms and to focus on the barriers. And what we have to do as leaders of literacy is to support teachers to understand why they have a reading age that low, okay? And very often it can be linked back to those root causes around early reading. So this is based on the Simple View of Reading. It's a model from the EF's Key Stage 2 guidance report. And it's really useful. If you haven't looked at the Key Stage 2 report, I really would look at it, because if we are trying to tackle this challenge of students coming to secondary and not having got to the standard we need them to yet, we've got to backtrack and got to think, how do we scaffold them up? But this, you might have a reading age of 8, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have weaknesses with your word reading or decoding. So how do we know that? We've got to use assessment really diagnostically. Sometimes we might use it as a screener for everybody, but then we've got to think, is that specific enough for those who we know are struggling? And if it's not, how can we shrink that problem by using better assessment? And I use the York assessment, a York assessment of reading comprehension. It's one-to-one. You use it with a fewer amount of students, but it really breaks it up into word reading, fluency, comprehension. And then I can make a decision about which intervention I'm going to match those students up with, because there's no point putting them on a phonics intervention if it's actually some vocabulary comprehension that they need a bit more support with. So it's about being assessment driven. And I'm not going to spend a long time explaining to you, well, unless you want to interrupt me and ask me if you're not quite sure. But when we're talking about reading ages, on the surface, that seems quite a reasonable thing to do in schools, doesn't it? It's tangible. We think, okay, I've got a reading age of 11 or 12. Yeah, we can understand that. But I think there's often a lack of understanding of how that reading age has actually come about. So almost kind of educating staff how those tests work are really important. So for example here, if I'm a 14-year-old and I've sat a reading age assessment, I've got a raw score of 84, which puts me in the bottom 10% of my year group, my age group. I then get a reading age for the process of tracing back what age group got the same score as their average. So you can see here, if I got 84, I'm tracking it back to whoever got the average score, and then I'm tracking back down to the chronological age. And that means I've got an age of 10, a reading age of 10. Reading ages are based on average performance, not expected. There isn't a standard that we're saying you've got to do X, Y, and Z to have a reading age of 10, 11, 12. It's based upon a national cohort. And this is why sometimes we need to err on the side of caution, because dependent upon what your national picture looks like, that can skew. But it's useful. So it's one bit of information that's useful. And if it's used alongside the more standardised age, so the standard age score, the stay nines, we can get a bit of a better picture as to how our pupils are performing in comparison to national cohorts. Because often they're based on this idea of a bell curve like we have at GCSE. Okay, so if you are in a school that's measuring reading, using reading ages, whatever test you're using, think about how often are you doing this? If you're doing it more than twice a year, you're doing it too much. Okay, my schools this year, we've gone year 7, we're going to do it twice, September, and then spring 2, and then after that we do it once a year. Because realistically, what's the point? What is the point of weighing that pig if you are not doing lots of things in between to actually give them a chance to catch up? So be really careful. Make sure you talk to the people who are running these tests about what are the benefits of the tests and what are the limitations. They can be really helpful, but we don't want to put too much emphasis on them because they're a really complex measure. Okay, Dr. Jessie Ricketts is a good one to look up with in this area. She's written some really good articles online for the TES about this and why we should be so cautious. Okay.